Vishwanath Kashikar is Senior Associate Professor at CEPT University, Ahmedabad. Sarovar is an Associate Professor at Jindal University, Sonipat. Uh, Both have been old friends of C and have reviewed thesis works for several years now, and it has been the practice at C to kind of invite people to review again and again, so that we have a uh, longer arc of thinking about things. Uh, so two or three things before we start. Actually, I mean uh, this year's projects. I mean, the relationship between spatial configuration and life is at the core of these works. Actually, how does a spatial a specific spatial configuration bring about practices, produce different rituals of life, etc., etc., etc. So this has been the core, uh, and I mean, being very uh, clear that this relationship is not a empirically determinable relationship also, because subjectivities are different, people are different, the mediating body which kind of produces this relationship are also so diverse. So we cannot have this kind of, you know, uh, uh, an empirically connected relationship. So we've been trying to kind of work with drawings and, many ways of thinking about this relationship. And this year's works, if you notice, even yesterday and today, is is a is in a slightly different direction from previous year's works in terms of its thick descriptions, its thicknesses, and and all the work, if you see, are around narratives and have been experimenting with experiences, self experiences, self narratives, uh, their own voices, etc. So this has been this year's kind of move, really. And we are still kind of figuring out how do these narratives kind of help us clarify or articulate this relationship between space and life. This morning's presentation is from Gangtok, Kolhapur, and Whitefield, Bangalore, and it's and all three are about uh, what we loosely term as urbanization. So urbanization in India is kind of, is a very um, you know um, uh, used term, and then there is always people telling us that by 2050, 50% of India will be urbanized and these kind of things. And in 2011 census also, you have this kind of a, this kind of a number that was kind of that was published by the census department, but also subsequently by many urban scholars who spoke about how the number of cities have exponentially increased. And then there is always this image of this map, which is basically with this, with this dots across the country with so many cities, and there were some, you know I don't know, more than 3,000 cities across the country. So, and so there are two things: that new cities were emerging and existing cities were kind of growing. And the spots and that image kind of did not give a clear sense of what it means to urbanize, really. What does it what does urbanization really mean? And I think these three works today, this morning, is focused around this question of how do you kind of how do you kind of look at this process of urban expansion, urban intensification, urban growth, urban change and shift and transformation, and you know uh, intensification. How do you look closely? What exactly happens? What are the generating forces? What spatialities have they produced? What kind of new practices have emerged? And and this process of and all of them are located in the last 10-year, 15-year horizon. So how does this how does this urbanization actually happen? What are the mechanics of it? So we go to uh, Whitefield, which is an IT generated thing, Kolhapur outskirts, which is multiply kind of, there is deindustrialization, there is a reindustrialization of a certain kind, there's all kinds of pressures. And we go to Gangtok, which is a city which is kind of, rapidly changing with new migrants from the neighboring states. So I'll invite um, Pranav, Aditya, and Neha. Pranav first.
My thesis places itself in the years of the tertiary sector boom, post the economic liberalization in Bangalore. It deals with ideas of image making and the spatial implications of the aspirations on an individual, social, and societal scale. It attempts to elaborate the imaginations of an ideal home, neighborhood, and what is wanted, unwanted in a space of residence. The turn of the millennia saw a new form of urbanity emerging in the Indian context, driven by the IT industry. In particular, the service industry set up its outsourcing hubs in Bangalore, Hyderabad, and Gurgaon. Large-scale spatial reforms took place in these cities, a flux in urban form, with Bangalore being at the forefront. The corporate workforce, the emerging middle class in a new money economy, with a surge in resources and capital, has appeared to shape the emerging urban form in the city peripheries. Therefore, I ask the question, how do the aspirations of a growing new money economy, middle class, in a rapidly urbanizing place shape a neighborhood? The chosen site for study is Whitefield, a suburb located to the far east of the city. Being one of the newer localities, it is here where the newer urban forms are most intense. Through each of these neighborhoods, there were two primary objectives. One, to understand the larger political, economic forces that begin to shape the framework of the neighborhood and its inhabitants. Two, delving into the personal, magnified perspective of the individual to understand smaller instances of aspirations, community dynamics, and the biases taking place in the everyday. The fieldwork has therefore taken the form of 5 stories that have been woven together, the personal experience and observations on site with varying degrees of semi-fictional narratives. Growing up in the city, the semi-fiction is derived from the numerous instances that I have lived and experienced in these varying contexts. Of these, I will briefly take you through 2 neighborhoods, while the others can be flipped through in the book. The story of present-day Whitefield goes back about 140 years ago, when the erstwhile Mysore Maharaja granted large parcels of land to a few British workers in his administration. The bungalows were built around a large circular ground called the Green, on 2 concentric roads. This came to be known as Whitefield's inner and outer circle. Here, the local panchayat was run by volunteer groups among families. Repair and other engineering works were taken care of autonomously. This organization of neighborhood allowed a sense of belonging with other stakeholders being known entities. The neighborhood remained largely unchanged through the years of independence. By the 1980s, however, many of the original settlers were quite aged, and their children had begun to move out of the country. Mrs. D'Souza's husband was an army officer and was stationed in multiple cities across the country. During their time in Bangalore in the 1980s, they began looking for a place to retire and found Whitefield and its community appealing to live in as it provided a fairly social life amongst neighbors who were Catholics. With a large garden, a long driveway, and many landscape ornaments placed around the half-acre property, Mrs. D'Souza speaks of her efforts to buy the bungalow, maintain it, and the garden in its original shape with much pride. Paul, Mrs. D'Souza's son, who is now in his late 40s, speaks of his childhood fondly. He reminisces how the streets and the ground were far emptier and the interactions with his neighbors far friendlier. The Sundays were enjoyed through feasts held in the neighbors' houses, and any fresh baked goods from the houses was distributed along the entire street. The old folk were here up till the 1980s. Since then, a lot of changes happened, she says. In the early 1990s, liberalization, tax exemptions, land, and new infrastructure attracted multinational corporations to establish their headquarters here at the new International Tech Park. This brand new software hub brought about three transformations in the neighborhood. One, the empty lands and other estates were taken over by real estate firms and began to transform these into some of the country's first gated communities, as multiple villas and apartment blocks. Two, the properties on which the old bungalows stood gained a large amount of value and many families sold them off. These were razed to the ground to build brand new buildings. In this process, many plots were also sold in fragments. Three, the building owners began to put up their bungalows for rent. In the desperation to extract most value, many bungalows were let out for both residential as well as commercial purposes and renovated accordingly. The arrival of an unfamiliar community began to induce an anxiety of security. Anyone beyond the compound walls was seen with a lens of suspicion. The older houses had picket fences, low compound walls, large front yards, which allowed much porosity between the immediate street and the house within. The newer houses began to treat these as properties as separate entities from the rest of the neighborhood that surrounded it, a secluded space where the outside stays out and the inside stays in. Mrs. D'Souza's neighbors are now a guitar and music studio. A preschool is now the tenant of a bungalow behind. Down the road is a large bungalow which now hosts a yoga school. A Kashmiri restaurant has been the tenants of another bungalow by the garden on the opposite side of the ground. Tied to the apartment gates are signs which mention no visitors parking and only cars with member stickers allowed, among others. Here, security guards sit with their wooden sticks on a plastic chair by the cabin. Paul now locks the main gate every time he steps out of the house. His mother can be seen sitting in the patio by the corner or plucking some flowers in her garden. She now talks across the front gate, having no keys to the lock for her own safety. The short compound wall, painted in very pretty white and green colors, has two barbed wires running across its entire length. Ironically, two porcelain doves are hung by the board that reads "Perfect Peace" by the gate. Manjunath has been responsible for the construction of three multi-story buildings. These are 1 BHK flats with two flats on each of the 5 floors and are intended to be given for rent. The work on these buildings have been fairly fast due to all buildings having the exact same layout. The other flats too are 1 BHKs or PGs built only within the last 2 years. New IT now. Are you also IT? Manjunath asks, as these brand new developments cater to a very specific crowd in mind. Young bachelors who are looking to move to relatively pocket-friendly residences not too far from their software offices. Previously, a large estate stood here, consisting of a few plantation orchards and a bungalow in the middle. The land was sold to a layout developer in mid-2019, and work began on the new layout began in January of 2020. Laying the new lanes included integrating a drainage system, electrical conduits, and widening of roads. The main road was widened to 3 lanes, accommodating parking of cars. Work had ceased for a few months during the onset of the pandemic and eventual lockdown, gravely hindering progress. The COVID-19 pandemic and the lockdown meant there ceased to exist a market of migrants, employees, looking for housing near offices, essentially leaving all the flats empty. The 1 BHK operates on a model which follows an almost mass manufacturing of housings, with expectations to find immediate tenants and therefore much faster turnover of rents in return. This explains the monotony of all facades, layouts, and utilization of land, given it is the easiest way to keep costs down with quick construction. Nikhil is one of the new tenants in the flat by the corner and moved in 3 months ago after getting transferred to his company's Bangalore office from his hometown, Hyderabad. He rides his Royal Enfield to work at 8:45 in the morning to his office located 10 minutes away and makes sure he's back at home by 6 in time for the maid to clean the flat. Nikhil and his roommate usually receive a packed meal for dinner, provided by a tiffin service, and a kitchen located in the corner of the lane at around 8:30. Tiffin services such as this almost exclusively cater to individuals who live independently, given their convenient and remove the headache of keeping multiple grocery items in their houses. Convenience has also spurred many laundry services, providing pickup and delivery to home at any desired time during the day. Beside the tiffin service is a small angadi, a shop which came up very recently, after the gradual increase in the number of tenants on the buildings beside. The Angadi has become a usual spot for chai sota among the neighbors, apart from providing daily groceries and condiments. Post lockdown spurred the construction of more flats. However, on a street having nearly 70 flats, only 10 tenants currently live. The anxiety of low demand has taken the form of multiple to-let boards that try and grab attention through the display of bright colors, a list of amenities provided by the building, and attractive rent written across in large bold letters. To-let boards are now scattered all across ECC Road and on every corner of the neighborhood. On electric poles, gates, electrical conduit boxes, and fences. Despite this near desperate effort, most flats still sit empty. Nikhil is very enthusiastic about showing around the flat and gives a brief breakdown of the various amenities they provide, the rent, security, while also mentioning the distances to offices and other commercial hotspots. Paying 18,000 rupees between his roommate and himself, another 2,000 for repairs and maintenance, he finds it a reasonable price for the space and locality of the flat. He says location was one of the main reasons for choosing the flat, apart from living in a convenient proximity to the office. He frequents the newly opened breweries and malls situated close by on Friday and Saturday nights. Sundays would include an occasional game of football early in the mornings. Nikhil and his roommate joined one of the many local sports groups in the neighborhood where they organize a game by renting out the local turf for a few hours, just down the road. Nikhil expects a promotion soon and hopes to move to a larger society not too far away with more upscale money, begin to prioritize convenience within their means. This includes affordable services, a comfortable space in the localities that meet metropolitan standards of living, and an aspiration of a cosmopolitan lifestyle during the weekend, leading to the emergence of the 1 BHK and PG type of housing, which begin to afford these relatively economically. An aspiration of a private, secluded living has merged with the anxiety of security. These morph into monolithic, imposing structures with little regard to its immediate context. The global tertiary sector, providing the means to dictate as residents of choice and execute imaginations of a dream house, the ideas of community living, clubhouses, and amenities begin to proliferate among the wealthy and the upper middle class. The home, the home is seen as an aspiration of peaceful living while also incorporating aspects of environmentalism, Western exoticism, and beauty. Many of these imaginations have taken the form as replications of American cul-de-sacs and private gated neighborhoods, where a residence becomes a curated bubble. Importantly, the villages caught in the midst of a global city lead to the impulse of leading a dignified urban life. The attempt in finding means to achieve this takes form in multiple ways. Landowners utilize rising demand for space through rent and migrant housing. This reimagines built form within the fabric, giving rise to low-cost row housing, chawl types, and the idea of an urban adapted RCC home. The village fabric has altered itself in catering to the everyday and menial of the other localities, communities, and societies. The degrees to which, the degrees to which one is able to mobilize these aspirations vary and may not always be achieved to its desired extent. Individuals, societies, and communities make do with multiple compromises in between. The implications of these manifestations begin to create evident degrees of inclusion, exclusion, biases, outlooks, and spatial injustice. It begins to harden social structures, inducing a blasé attitude, an indifference to existing, softer relationships, and halting the formation of new ones. As architects, we capitalize on forms of aspirations, shaping urbanity, the structures of everyday. It becomes crucial to ask where they come from.
think the uh, I mean these are like he mentions Gurgaon, he mentions Whitefield, Cyberabad, Electronic City, and these are really um, cities on some steroid, you know, uh, injection. And you, the thing is that, of course, he mentions this whole. There is an environmental impulse. There is a impulse for good living. There is an impulse for, the Beverly Hill kind of image. Uh, but then he also points out through his stories the stark polarities, no, between and stark polarities of space, and this you see in all of them. But also, I mean, uh, and but appear very disconnected and spatially very different. They're intensely connected because labor kind of moves through them. Uh, we'll discuss why he chose to write this as a series of stories. I think uh, that's the methodological kind of and also his choice of drawings. Uh, I'll invite Aditya to take us to Kolhapur outskirts.
Emerging urbanization, the story of Kolhapur's expansion. City extents reveal a complex and dynamic nature. Here, homemaking practices give rise to a peculiar built form distinct from both the formal city and the village. This thesis therefore asks what forces shape the built form at the extents of the city. It works with collecting stories from the villages around Kolhapur city through the map delineates two villages, Nagaon and Pachgaon, to analyze four cases. First, the nomadic pastoral inhabitations, the intensification of old village houses, the suburban layouts, and the shifts in agrarian landscapes. So the first case, the grazing fields are pastoral lands in the hilly regions of the village. Pastoralism is a way of life for people living here. The story is about the nomadic pastoralists whose movement follows the farming calendar, making homes through temporary shelters. Amid city expansions, highway developments, and industrial growth, rocky, unproductive agricultural lands on the extents of Nagaon were leased to nomadic pastoralists for 100 years. With the end of land tenure, it was declared as an encroached land. Home to the Dhangar community, the settlement also shelters people from Gopar, Vadar, Mahar, and Matang communities who were considered the lowest castes in the Hindu social system. Gopal or the Gauda caste is involved in dairy farming, while Vadar work as construction workers. Mahar and Matang communities were involved in cleaning human waste, gutters, and agricultural labor. Today, we see them working as house helps, drivers, and industrial laborers. Therefore, many people live here, from daily wage workers and small entrepreneurs to those working in large industrial units. The lower castes entered the production and service industry as the inline staff. This is Ajit's house made of bamboo, wood, and patra. His cooking space, cleaning, and washing areas. The shift in built form occurs from tent and straw sheds, brick houses, patra houses, and introduction of toilets to the current form of extended houses with the shed of the old pastoralists. The shift in built form of Ajit migrated from the Bid district in Maharashtra. He belongs to the Mahar community and works in a metal foundry. He bought this house for 1 lakh rupees from his friend who had changed his factory job. From the pastoral house, the house was transformed with extensions, toilets, partitions, and some furniture. Later, Ajit added a bathing space, more partitions, and changed the flooring as well. The intensification of old village houses. The village dynamics follows various land affordances, ranging from small and hilly settlements and government lands to housing colonies, parking plots, and various other layouts. The inner village is home to people from wealthy Jain and Lingayat communities who own large farmlands and businesses. Kumbhi and Gavdi, Maratha subcaste who are considered lower than the higher agrarian communities, reside near the farmlands. These are small farmers and industrial workers from these communities. One such person is Amar, whose home got changed, upgraded, and expanded. It grew over the years through continuous improvements involving very meticulous use of money, materials, and resources. Such homes are always in the making. We see his resting space, kitchen, and storage. The house was built by his grandfather with a chula and a mori. His father expanded the house after marriage, adding another room and getting some furniture as well. Amar, with the help of a contractor, extended the house in RCC. When his daughter became pregnant and moved back to her maternal home, the construction of a toilet became very important to him. His son reached a marriageable age, but many parents didn't wanted their daughters to marry him due to the lack of separate room for the newly wed couple. They added a partition to create a small room. The money he spent came from his savings. Later, he began the construction of the upper floor where his son's family shall live. The suburban layouts. Politics of land, agencies, and the aspirations of people have given rise to a peculiar urban form in the village of Pachgaon. The stories of this land are intertwined with the landholders. The Land Acquisition Act allowed the government to acquire underdeveloped lands, which led many zamindars to reclaim rights through compensations, changing zones, leading to a surge in property values. Lands were reserved for lower castes as well. The area developed into a strong Maratha community led by influential politicians. However, much of the land remained with the people, whose agency shaped development through plotting, subdividing, and leasing. Today, the locality is a sparsely dense middle class neighborhood with small bungalows, home to salaried individuals like clerks, accountants, and school teachers. Rajashree's dad owned 200 gunte of land, portions of which were sold to people for 1,000, 5,000, and 10,000 rupees with an affidavit. Therefore, there is an emergence of construction agencies that provide foolproof housing solutions from design and estimates to loans, material purchasing, and erection. Space is conceived through required rooms, and homes happen through the complex logistics of building making. All the houses share a similar design lineage, having a veranda, living room, kitchen, bedroom, and a common toilet arranged in a square layout. This is Rajeshri's house, which was built by one such agency. Her living room, kitchen, dining spaces. She aspires to live in a bungalow and lead a dignified life with a higher social stature. The notion of property ownership comes from the fear of social security in a sparsely dense neighborhood, resulting in a solid compounded built form. Despite the heavy burdens of debts, the desire for an own house remains a strong driving force. The shift in agrarian landscapes. This story opens the obscure relationship between agriculture and industries shaped by the politics of land and local governance. From small parcels of land plotted by a group of farmers to brothers claiming lands, unauthorized occupations, and stay orders, to the workers' union and the politics of Gram Panchayat produce a distinct form of urbanization. Industries range from textile mills, dairy processing, to spare parts, steel plants, and foundries, often accompanied by industrial housing. Farmers are starting their production units and rental schemes on farmlands. Farmers are increasingly involved in leasing, renting, and hospitality, continuing agriculture through secondary means. Consequently, such chawl-type structures have emerged within the farmlands owned by the farmers. To such houses in one of the mixed-use layouts. Miraj Ali lives in an apartment rental and works as a porter in a transport service. Every year he visits his village in Bihar where his parents farm. We see their kitchen, sleeping space, and toilet areas. He shares household responsibilities with his friend Jashan, a driller, who lives with his wife and children. The three-story building has 4 rooms per floor, connected by a common passage and staircases. The terrace and corridors become the social spaces. Therefore, homes emerge through these complexities of caste and community, individual impulses, family dynamics, aspirations for dignified living, and the obscure relationship between agriculture and industries. Houses take the form of temporary dwellings shaped by the ideas of legitimacy and illegitimacy to an accrete form through incremental developments for old houses, to a commodified house form for the layouts, and the emergence of chawl type and apartment type structures in the farmlands. Life happens through the friction of permanence and impermanence for the pastoralist to an agile life trying to come to terms in case of Amar, whereas an introverted inward life for Rajashri, while a cyclic form for the industrial workers. The shift in spatiality happens where, uh, where spatiality happens with the need of permanence in the first case, whereas the houses emerge through fragments in the second one. The idea of home shifts towards a BHK for the layouts, whereas farmlands are shifted from affordances of cultivation to facilitating housing for the agrarian landscapes. Therefore, the thesis finds that for the workers, nomadic building practices have directly translated into fugitive or unlawful ways of homemaking through immense amounts of caste-based segregation. People shape homes through impulses that are not merely aspirational, but contribute to a dignified life in case of the old houses. The agency of urban development lies with the people, involving complex dynamics of land and homemaking practices, which is quite different from government layouts or housing schemes developed by developers in the third case, whereas farmers are becoming entrepreneurs by entering the manufacture, real estate, and service industries, engaging themselves with complexities of land, legalities, and taking charge of development themselves. Therefore, homemaking practices in city extents occur through such complex internal and external forces that shape the house form. The emergence of new landscapes appearing as an expanding city are narratives of shifts in urban environments, producing an ecosystem with distinct urban form and life. Therefore, the thesis opens up a discourse on these emerging urban environments within the scattered fabric of contemporary cities, where the city is not expanding, but the region is changing. Thank you.
Thanks, Aditya. I mean, it's uh, uh, this whole idea that the city happens. No, it cannot be planned. Plans just nudge, but it requires so many things for cities to happen. Like the internal dynamics of families, the external caste mobilizations, mobilities, the whole political economy changes, industrial changes, land availability, movement of goods, shifts in international trade. So many things kind of make cities. No, it's not easy to trace one linear narrative, but it's and as a corollary to that, then the question, can cities be really planned? No, like, and we've seen what happens to planned cities, whether it is gift city or whether it is Sahara city or whether it is Lavasa city or even the older cities of Chandigarh and New Bombay, which took around 50, 60 years to become cities. So it's not they didn't become city immediately as soon as they were planned. So I think what Aditya's thesis does is it kind of opens up these mechanics as to how, in this very crisp document, the how does Kolhapur kind of is expanding and extending. Kolhapur, remember, is a rich city, is one of the rich cities in Maharashtra. Is one, it's full of small traders and small industries and plenty of agricultural produce. So it has those dynamics also, but he brought out the politics of caste, which is so um, uh, intense in this landscape. I'll ask Neha to present us the case of Gangtok, which is a peculiar case of how migrants inhabit a contoured terrain and what happens to built form and life.
Higher density led reconfiguration of space and life, Gangtok. The emerging landscape on the hill of Gangtok is driven by the rise of rental market. The emerging landscape, good. The emerging landscape on the hill of Gangtok is driven by the rise of rental market, which has resulted in the rapid construction of buildings. These forms are reproduced, often mirroring the apartment type. With 55% of Sikkim's urban population now living in Gangtok, new neighborhoods have significantly increased the city's built up areas. As already dense neighborhoods become even more congested and new ones are built on vulnerable slopes, how much more density will the city be able to hold in the future? Neighborhoods in Gangtok have grown organically along the roads. Because of slopes, landslides, and rain, accessing land is difficult and every square feet becomes valuable, leading to full utilization of plot areas. Overcrowded buildings push into street space, affecting ventilation, drainage, and accessibility. As a result, people have to find ways to access their properties, such as using mobile stairs placed on neighbors' rooftop or carving out stairs between buildings. However, these steep, poorly lit walkways are difficult for the elderly to access and complicate carrying the sick and the diseased. Movement of goods is difficult in case of construction, especially during the rains. With 94 inches of annual rainfall, the city's water flows to rivers through natural drainage basins. But dense neighborhoods and water disposal have clogged these pathways, leaving them vulnerable. This blockage, combined with exposed water supply and sewer pipelines running alongside, have reduced drains' capacity to handle runoff, making the entire neighborhoods vulnerable. With this, I arrive at my research question: how does a very high density of people express itself into built form in hilly terrains, and what kind of life does it produce? This study examines a dense neighborhood in Gangtok, tracing its transformation from urban agricultural land to a densely populated urban area. Using speculative mapping and oral histories, it explores how the rising residential density and building practices shape the social dynamics of this hill city. The land in Daragaon originally belonged to aristocrats with close ties to the monarchy. These lands, passed down through the generations, supported a self sufficient life of government work, farming, and poultry, and homes were simple wooden structures with bamboo and grass roofs. Houses were organized around verandas with front and backyards for communal gatherings and religious activities. Their lands stretched to boundaries marked by streams or trees. Pathways, rather than formal boundaries, often defined property lines. After Sikkim's merger with India in 19 reflecting a desire for permanence and a shift in family priorities. The 1990s saw a gradual increase in concrete homes in Daragaon, often constructed incrementally due to financial or family needs. These homes followed a linear arrangement with rooms organized around a corridor. New residents arrived, securing plots and constructing homes with the help of mistris and draftsmen who drafted the plans visualized by the owners themselves. Some families rented out older Ikra homes. Rental prices were relatively low since Daraga was still distant from the central city amenities. By 2010, significant population increase led to changes in building regulations. Daragaon was zoned for 5 floors plus a terrace, prompting residents to build upwards for resident rental income. Residents had already begun adding floors in areas nearer to the city center, with upper levels offering better views and ventilations as neighboring buildings rose. Moisture issues led some to construct walls offsetting from the retaining walls, creating back corridors for service lines, later rented to the transient workers and students. Homes near the main roads adapted ground floors for commercial uses, adding shops, eateries, bank branches, transforming Daragaon into a mixed use neighborhood. The built-up area had significantly increased by 2024, resulting in a shortage of open spaces for the public and leading to overcrowding in those spaces. Many buildings blend residential and commercial uses, reaching maximum height allowances along narrow alleys. Terraces plays an important role as gathering spaces with festivals, play areas, and informal gatherings. Limited public spaces force meetings into shops and markets, with occasional shared spots at path junctions offering rare open breathing spaces. The above study states that the Bilform density has increased significantly in the last 10 years. With the rise in density, open spaces have diminished, yet the publicness has intensified. An increasing floating population has led to the emergence of more shared spaces, blurring the boundaries between public and private realms. Residential buildings now incorporate commercial spaces and shared corridors, terraces, streets, and institutions. The emerging urban condition features buildings shared by owners and renters, serving homeowners' aspirations and tenants' needs. Typically, lower floors are relatively more open with corridors, balconies, and separate entrances for each level, depending on the terrain. In contrast, the upper floors, where the owner resides, are accessed by distinct entrance and the spaces become more private and internalized as they rise. The nuclear families, the nuclear owner families occupy 2 to 3 floors and multiple renting families reside on the lower 2 floors with each family averaging 2 rooms. Due to limited open spaces, terraces have become essential for social gatherings, children's play, and even religious services. While homeowners use their terraces as extended family gathering spots, tenants' children often lack dedicated play spaces and resort to parking lots or shared areas like courtyards. One of the open space, a badminton court within a house with a central courtyard, was taken care of by the owner specifically for outdoor sports. As it is the only courtyard in the area, it has become a playground for both the tenants' children and the neighborhood kids, as the elderly now rarely use it. In the past decade, informal institutions like churches have emerged and have become increasingly common in residential clusters. Approximately one church exists for every 15 to 20 houses in Daragao, with services often held in private homes or on terraces. Increased density has led to interconnected communities and inspired new forms of institutions. Homes and communal institutions coexist within sectional layers, creating a spatial social framework where homes and shared institutions are interwoven. The emerging urban condition reflects a shift in housing types, focusing on privacy and openness. Over the past decade, the privatization trend has reshaped residential environments, with homes evolving from communal entryways to gated upper floors. As ground level spaces shrink, shared areas like terraces have emerged, furthering the second urban condition, where community engagement intensifies despite limited open ground. Meanwhile, balconies, shops, and streets act as informal extensions of public and private spaces, encouraging social connections. Furthermore, the relationship between homes and domestic institutions express a layered urban condition, with new forms of communal structures emerge and social life is lived within the sectional layers of interconnected buildings. This increase in publicness within a densely built environment is characterized by private ownership. Vertical expansion and dense housing arrangements have led to the emergence of shared spaces that add to the sense of community among the residents of diverse backgrounds, leading to more integrated social networks and a defined sense of publicness. Thank you.
So even if there is uh, less open space, the publicness seems to have increased. No, that's the central argument that 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 the way the spatial configuration has kind of brought in these community spaces and institutions and the whole series of uh, you know spaces for people. It kind of, even though there is very high intensification of built form, the nature of public has also increased. uh, I think I just want to kind of make one point before I invite both of you, which is about how do you write these uh, changing, you know, evolving physicalities or evolving these cities. So, I mean, three of them have used this whole idea of biographies of cities of place. You know, how do you kind of using some protagonists or some piece of land or some plot, you kind of figure out a way to write the history of the place or the biography of a place, and and also because there are just too many things to otherwise uh, to write about, which can be which uh, which is otherwise impossible to hold if it is not written in this biographical narrative form. You know, there are just too many things to hold together to kind of tell you a meaningful story, and that's why this whole idea of biography of a city or a narrative on a city. So with that, I'll invite both of either of you or both of you to kind of make your remarks and comments.
Thank you, uh, Prasad, and all three of you. Um, and this point that you're making on the urbanism hinged on pakka housing. Urbanism hinged on a certain kind of multi-story pakka floor, uh, block house. In your case, in her case, there is what is happening in Gangtok. So how is urbanism then measured through concretization? I'm giving you a kind of a speculative question because you all are kind of pushing to an idea of the built and urban. Um, because in your case also, in her case also, there is these places which in a classification system of urban, they'll be called peri-urban or something like, I don't even know what that means, to tell you honestly. Because also, I mean, I teach in a place which is supposed to be a peri-urban city, but it's not a city. It's a highway and it's a field, and then there is a spaceship that has landed on top of it. So it's kind of like it's a private university which has sealed doors, everything. Very different. I mean, while you can say that when you are in sea, you are in a city, right? Very different. So one thing I want you all to reflect on is this notion of uh, how is when is urbanism? Since these guys ask all the when, why questions, and what is urban? Okay, because urban can mean so many things. Okay, would you define urban as like supposing a village has a high number of interreligious and intercaste marriages? Is that not urbanism? Is it not urban, modern? What is it? And it has all the houses are kacha floor. I'm just telling you to play with this idea because all of you are kind of dwelling on it. Or what is the, in a sense, I'm gonna go to Pranav now. So you use the term middle class in your title. Now you're gonna middle class कहाँ से define कर दिया? So middle class का एक मिडिल क्लास का जो नोशन है वो बिल्कुल इसमें नहीं है सिवाय those studio apartments. So the middle class has a certain kind of definition. It is part of a certain era. Bangalore, which has gone like an army officer's bungalow, to is not middle class. Whatever they're going to do in it, definitely not middle class. A bungalow is not middle class. I mean, I wish it was. We all got one, but it's not middle class. Um, and the IT job, the white collar job in Bangalore is not actually middle class because it's insane their salaries. So it would have been interesting if you would have understood a little bit of this tension of the definition of the middle class, not only through a spatial built order or like what is happening to that area as a city. Is not generating a middle class, and also the tension of the kind of the relationship that the white collar and the blue collar in a city like Bombay, in a city like Bangalore, blue, who are the workers, where is this place located, who comes, is there service apartments, all kinds of things. So kind of looking at bringing in a little bit more detail on idea of work, because that will then generate what is middle class and what is not. And here is the kind of place where there are different kinds of people living: upper class, upper middle class, working classes, maybe also living in the smaller settlements around. Because there's also a huge service industry in Bangalore. You can get everything home delivered, right? So just kind of build in a density of that, because you're using a term and you're working on an area and you're mapping different kinds of houses. And I think there's a kind of distraction to the lure of the and the form of the build, so that somehow you kind of forgot to do all other things. Anyways, it's one thing. Can I just ask everybody together? How are you doing it yesterday? Okay. Aditya, a very interesting set of drawings and houses you looked at. And you looked at this idea of incremental architecture. You know, the government of India's basic survey, the NFHS surveys that they do, one way of measuring, this connects to yours also, one way of measuring a family's class status is by measuring kacha and pakka floor. Now that kacha pakka floor does not mean like there's a question in like half of government of India surveys. कि आपका flooring कच्चा है पक्का है, okay? So concrete is class, is a class shift, and in your thing, what I felt was interesting was um, this is where all the questions ki what is the urban? So you said there is a Maratha community there. Like where I work is a place surrounded by probably khap panchayats. But there's this, who is classifying that as urban? What is the, the smart city plan? उसको वो तो वो ऊपर से label आ रहा है, नीचे क्या हो रहा है? And because you guys went into the density of the local, it's important to then kind of, so you mentioned the communities, but you didn't really mention what it actually means. To have caste-based padas, right? So and then to kind of reflect that off with urbanism as an idea because you're exploring that. Mm, I really like that thing you had shown of those houses, those prefab type looking of house. They're not prefab, and there's a kitchen which has been put in into a drawing room, and there's a dining table in front of it, and it's that kitchen. I mean that rack. What do you call it? The steel rack in India is like it's just amazing. I think we should measure urbanism and ruralism or whatever with the presence of that rack, the steel rack, okay, and the number of columns it has in the. So it's very interesting because that photo you had shown, there's a dining table in front, there's a fridge on the side, and that rack is like very prominently displayed. So of course, it's a pakka ghar, uh, and that all I'm saying is because you have so much data in your conclusions, investigate the categories a little bit more analytically. That's all. Um, and Neha, oh my God, Gantok, what a nice fieldwork. Yeah. Okay. Um, you showed this archive from 1960s onwards. How did you get it? लोगों से बात करके वो कुछ भी बोलेंगे. Just always remember, people will tell you what you want to hear. Most of the times, the first time when you go, they tell you what you want to hear. Anyways, um, also it's interesting to think of like a hill station town slightly differently, because I don't know, like hill station, I'm saying for the lack of any other word, but um, hill towns have developed very differently. Like I'm someone who visits both Dehradun and McLeodganj for like the last 25 years, and I don't know if it's urban, if it's city. It is just like a congestion and cluster of like growing on the mountain, which is just happening because of tourism, etc. And I know Gantok is not entirely just about tourism. What would have been interesting is to then, in a sense, what I'm asking you to do is to question the category of classification of Gantok as a city. And because, like what you were showing, that there is these fields and then there are these really congested build-ups. So what are the ways that then in, one starts thinking that this is a city or not a city, this is a mountain which has been, or a valley, which has been inhabited. Um, and not to have the fear to do that. Like, you know, if it's not fitting in your clear category that this is a urban city, urbanization, then you don't have to fit it. It's okay. You can say that there is, because your data shows a lot of stuff where it's not easily bracketed. You can say कि ठीक है, it's a capital, government ने ये करा है, उसको city बोला है, उनका municipality है, but because your work on the build and what you're talking to people is very, it's a very differently organized city. So can you propose an idea of the mountain city as a different city, you know, a different way of organization of space, people. And also it's very interesting you mentioned these terrace churches. So what is the idea of coming, someone else who had something on, or it was just you, of people coming together like it's a little village square. So the notion of community is not changing. While in Bangalore, there is always alienation in all this, like singular flats. Nobody knows who their neighbor is. But the notion of community, the church movement, which is called the home church movement, which happens, I think, in Gangtok, um, it would be interesting to kind of reflect that, because it's a very uh, it's a very clear kind of resonance to the build where they've now created these terrace churches, right? And how they're using the terrace to continue a community, idea of a community. And a lot of cities in like in Shillong and other places also they have this kind of thing. So yeah, so in a sense, I'm basically trying to ask you all to think and reflect on the category of when is urbanism and what is urbanism and what is it made of.
Uh, yeah, so the question of the term middle class has been something which we've been discussing since the beginning of the thesis. So what I was mainly focusing here was largely the aspiration of a certain particular kind of living. And you're very right in saying that the most of the subjects which really have been shaping the emerging urbanity are not middle class. It's a very different sector of society itself. These are your white collar job holders who have top position in IT, in the IT workforce, which in itself is very um, exclusive in some ways, which have only some people have the resources to access to. But that has trickled down a certain sort of aspiration of having that this sort of house which is private, which has walls on four sides, and it is yours. And I want to live in a particular locality which has a certain amount of peace, which has a certain amount of social life and community life. But when that comes, that also starts to include a few other characters. Sorry.
Do you have segregation on the basis of caste and religion in colonies, housing colonies?
That is definitely there. So one of the villages that I was studying, the urban village over here. So it's an agrahara, and agrahara is basically a village of a community of Brahmins who look after a local temple. Now over here, it is generally the lower castes who are scattered in the peripheries, and it is this landowning caste which begins to sort of have the larger power dynamics. I mean, especially in the current economy where they are the only ones who are able to sort of keep up with the changing dynamics in terms of the value of the land. It is no longer agricultural, but rather it is now how much built up, how much can I build on it? Um, I mean, it's a, it's a, I mean, it's a question which I won't be able to answer so explicitly, but the thing is, I mean, even so even my family, we moved from the center of the city to the periphery, um, and everyone in our family told that, well, like why are you moving so far? Like, there's nothing but fields, and there's like it's just farmland there. But I mean, like, it's a question of like so my family wasn't able to answer whether like we're in proper Bangalore city or whether we're not. I mean, technically it had malls and everything, but we were also in the middle of nowhere where you couldn't get a grocery store within 4 or 5 kilometers, and you had to take a vehicle out. So it's I'm not able to really pinpoint what urbanism is there, but it's something in between. And I'm sure the same case is there in Gurgaon and Noida, where you have these large townships coming, and in the middle of nowhere, which really does not have that ecosystem to sustain a certain like a particular lifestyle.
I'll like to respond to this relationship between urbanism and materialism, and this and also the caste-based, and the caste-based thing with respect to urbanism. So the textbook definition of urbanism says that I'm just in, in general, the common notion of urbanism says that the increase in cities population is something which is called urban, but it's the, and that's where this materiality thing might come in. Ke new buildings are getting built, and maybe it's kacha ghar, pakka ghar, and it's segregated and sub-segregated in those terms. I'll answer this question in terms of an experience that I had 2 days ago. So it's like just walking around Kemp's Corner, and I saw the buildings around, and there were some old mansions in between, and I was just fascinated ki why haven't they yet been redeveloped, because other buildings around are just reached the skyscraper. No, I'm just wondering, and I was trying to understand its mechanics. Ki, there must be some land issue. There must be 100 owners. Maybe they're not getting some land rights, or there must be something around. So to understand this mechanics of change is something what we can call urbanism, the mechanics of change, rather than calling it the intensification or the increase in population or the increase in urbanity. Maybe.
So I would like to talk about this, the mountain city that you said. So I started with this concept like when I was in the city. So these forms of a metropolitan city, of malls, those kind of things I could see there being copy pasted. So then I had this question of, then the idea of a mountain city has been fairly new with these kind of hill stations like Shimla, Darjeeling. They've all been British made kind of hill stations which have always been for vacation. So then in cities like Gangtok, smaller, when there are a lot of job opportunities, people start coming, and then smaller neighborhoods start forming. So then I was trying to understand what is the nature of the city. Like the city has there has been new neighborhoods coming up with residential houses, and then slowly other things start coming in like banks, restaurants, and then they become smaller centers within the city. So they have become these highly dense urbanized pockets within the city, maybe, I think.
Reality connection of the city, whether it is a mall, a bank, concrete, row houses. Hmm? And psychically, it's not a city. Huh? Sociologically, also, it's not a city in a textbook definition. Cities are supposed to offer a sense of a break from the past, right? तो material break होता है, लेकिन वो sociological break तो नहीं होता है. We replicate everything. Padas we replicate. The same caste, you will find a building, everybody from the same caste. I mean, you can go Borivali में ही चले जाओ. I visit students, just go to a housing colony in Bombay, कहीं भी, and look at the nameplates. It was full, like nine Sindhi families. But then what is it? Is it a city? Anyways.
I think the textbook. Textbook. The census of India has a very interesting kind of definition for cities and towns, and it's interesting for you all to kind of think about it because it locates it in size, density, and occupation terms. And because of course they have to kind of, they are limited with their modernistic kind of agendas, and they need to define things and stuff like that, because that is required for them to mobilize the governance systems, whether there will be a gram panchayat or a municipal council or a corporation or these kind of things. So its size of 5,000, density of 400 persons per square kilometer, and occupation terms is 75% male working population to be in non-agrarian mode. So that's the textbook definition of cities. But what is interesting is I want to kind of point to the old text of Lefebvre actually. It's Urban Revolution, and in that the opening line of the way, I mean, unlike Lefebvre actually, the opening line is uh, it says most of this world is today urban. It's kind of, and when you kind of start going through the book, it's a very thin book. It's not a very thick book. Very thin book. You go through. Basically, he's talking of urban-like conditions. It's, and he's not able to pinpoint that condition very articulately, but kind of in his own ways, that you feel that it's like you will have city-like conditions in villages, you'll have village-like conditions in cities, you'll have this kind of things inside the house. You'll feel very feudal in the road. You'll feel extremely anonymous, and if you go to a village as a tourist, you feel different. You go to a village as a relative of somebody, you feel different. So I think he folds in so many direct things, and he kind of doesn't locate it in place, but in its experience, the urban experience. I think that's a very more useful way to kind of think about the urban in terms of its experience and in terms of its condition. Just to kind of add a footnote, Vishwanath.
I'll pick up on the city village thing because again it ties to all the presentations. Uh, I agree there are various ways in which we can define the city, and on one hand the state defines the city, like you said, primarily from a population density and occupation perspective, and creates the city village divide. And then there's the rural urban way of describing something as rural or urban. So I think classically the way it is put forth is the village is rural and the city is urban. And now there are a lot of discussions about whether this sort of binary exists, or do we have urban villages, or do we have rural cities. Yeah. From the multiple ways of looking at it, one imagination of the city and the village is could also be based on the sequence of building regulation to building construction, which is a planning way of imagining a city versus a village, where you say that a city, uh, it has master plans and it has these vision plans. Not to say that villages don't have any building regulation, but it goes hand in hand with the act of building. Uh, So in that context, it would be interesting to ask like something like Gangtok, the way you are describing the buildings started growing and the margins between buildings started reducing to an extent which no building by law would allow. It's a very interesting case of something that might be classified as a city, but the act of building is very rural. That it is piecemeal and it is accretive rather than planned. Uh, and at the same time, we do have situations where nowadays in villages, you have the same access to resources. So to me, one way of describing the urban condition, not the city, the urban condition, is whether having more money automatically means ease of access to convenience. The urban condition is that if I have more money, I can do Zomato, Amazon, I can do whatever, I can go to a better hospital, I can go to a better school. Whereas the rural condition says that increasing money does not necessarily mean I'll get Zomato, because that's the sort of rural condition, which to me ties back interestingly in different ways to each of your studies. So if I start with yours, Pranav. So I was wondering, when you were talking of how in Whitefield there is this shift from the idea of the village to the idea of the city, uh, whether you feel that this shift or this sort of tension is apparent because the jump has been dramatic. Okay, I was thinking this because all cities go through this process where the city expands and villages get subsumed in the city, right? So even in cities which are not fueled by IT, and if I do a study in that kind of a city, say any other city, there also it gets subsumed. But I was wondering, are you making the argument that if it shifts from an agrarian economy directly to a service economy, without the intermediate stage of industrial or production based economy? If I see many cities like Ahmedabad or Bhopal, you will see that the outskirts is where the factories are. But then slowly the factories get pushed outwards, and service industry comes in its place, and the factory has to keep going further away. But to me, that is the specificity of Bangalore, especially the growth of Bangalore on the eastern side, which is the Whitefield side, that you have these villages, and then suddenly it is the IT, right? It is jumping from one extreme to another extreme. And I feel that if you frame this discussion in that context, a lot of new aspects emerge of the kind of things that you're describing. Uh, but I would also like to tie this to another sort of common aspect, which is about your methods of doing research, where you said that because this is about spatial configuration in life, and most of you are using thick description as a way of getting into the study, in your case through semi-fictional narratives. I think to me, if you're using thick description as a method, then the medium in which you make the description is very important, because that affects the thickness of the description. So I am quite intrigued in your case, and I would like you to respond to it as to what made you choose watercolor as a medium, okay, for thick description. Because and because you chose watercolor, I, when you were presenting, I was going back to in art, impressionist, expressionist, and cubism, and I'm wondering if there are various ways in which art looks at reality, which one lends itself more to thick description, which allows the thickness to emerge. I'm not saying that you can't use watercolor, but whether the medium itself is affecting the thickness. So interestingly, in the parts you presented itself, when you made drawings of the two LED advertisements, and when you showed that photograph on that electricity transformer, the overlays of photographs and the tone posters, to me that afforded a thicker description than the abstract drawing you made of the poster, right? So to me, when you use thick description, because one is not talking of empirical research, one is not talking of empirical methods of analysis, I feel that thick description by itself is not research. Research happens based on your ability to extract from the thick description to give insights. Because you have described it so thickly, your insights into that phenomena are insightful or are sharper or things which other people can't see. So my sense is that I'm not able to see a lot of things in your watercolor. Maybe you are able to see because you have been there and you have many more stories to tell. Okay? Uh, just one more example I want to give in your case about thick description. So when you say middle class or when you say IT, right, in your semi-fictional narrative, there is a question, are you from IT? I think you should question whether IT as a classification system uh, is going against the idea of thick description, because within IT also you have janitors working in the IT industry, you have receptionists who are maybe earning only 20,000, and you have the startup founder who is earning in crores, right? So or for that matter, when you use the word middle class, of course, there is a economic definition to a middle class as to your annual income, which yes, which keeps changing as inflation increases. But I wish that there is a thick description way of arriving at the idea of the middle class if you're interested in that particular class. For example, I would say that if you go to a restaurant and you look at the menu card, whether you look at the right column or not of the prices, to me is an interesting way of describing the difference between middle class and upper middle class. Or but to me the difference between say a lower middle class and middle class is when I look at the name of the restaurant and the way the interior of the restaurant is, do I already take a decision not to go there because I feel that it is way above my class? And having multiple stories like that is a good way of arriving at middle class from a thick description perspective, right? Otherwise we tend to bracket that particular class as a middle class. uh, and then finally, because your study is about aspirations, okay, uh, so I think the study could take a slightly different turn depending on how you're framing this study. Are you saying that if growth had not happened or towards the Whitefield side, if the city had not grown, aspirations would not have changed or not have changed drastically? That aspirations change because the village is converted into a city? Or are you primarily saying that if the growth was not fueled by IT, aspirations would have changed differently? So say for example, the way Bangalore is growing towards Mysore Road, Kanakpura and all those, are you trying to make an argument that the way things are changing on that side is very different from this side? Because that will clarify what role IT plays in your study, right? Or Whitefield as a particular thing plays in your study. Okay. Uh, Okay, Aditya, in your case, so I'm just doing all questions together. So I found your research question or hypothesis very pertinent, where you're asking, do homemaking practices uh, affect the peculiar way in which the build form is neither a city nor a village, right? So to me, the point of entry into your study was the fact that homemaking practices differ uh, for either different groups of people in that same area. So I want you to describe a little bit more what are homemaking practices. Okay. So for someone, for example, cooking your own food in your where you sleep is a homemaking practice. For someone else, getting your house repainted or adding something, buying a new sofa or buying a bed is a homemaking practice. Okay. For someone else, it might be calling or ensuring that at least 3 of your relatives stay with you might be a homemaking practice. So I feel that and in the photographs that you are showing, I was quite intrigued that especially I think the apartment kind of thing in the middle of nowhere, which was I think part of the shift of agrarian practices. So I was quite intrigued. There are fields and there is this 3-story, 4-story kind of building, and it seemed that they are being occupied by people who are sharing rooms, right? They don't have families, some of them. So I'm just wondering what is a homemaking practice for them, and therefore, is that a home for them? Yeah. Maybe it is a home, and therefore you are saying that that peculiarity of build form is emerging because they are okay with that kind of build form as a home, whereas someone who is part of your suburban or your old village house, for them homemaking practice means something else. Yeah. Uh, because in the absence of that, I think one might tend to misread your narrative to say that change in materiality from adobe mud or to cement is the shift that you're seeing. But if I have to look at it as homemaking practice, and this is where I also see the tensions where villages shift or uh, rural areas become urbanized. Uh, in many societies or in many villages, at least earlier, rearranging your tiles every year is part of homemaking practice, or doing cow dung lipan on the floor is a homemaking practice. Now, because the state sees pakka houses as brick and concrete, uh, because of that there is a push to change the materiality of the house, but in that change in materiality, that homemaking practice is lost. So a decade or so back we were doing a study or a related study tours of villages around Ahmedabad. It was fascinating that because of this push they had changed from tiled roof and adobe mud walls to brick walls. uh, and because it was part of Indira Awas Yojana, it had cement plaster, and then people were applying mud plaster on top of it, because that mud plaster was not part of building construction or durability, it is part of homemaking practice. But this, I think, works very differently for the construction workers or truck drivers or other people who are staying in that house, right? For them, that spending that time in the house by doing plastering is not homemaking practice. So I'm just wondering what are homemaking practices for them? Uh, and that to me would really bring out the nuanced differences between the 4 categories that you had uh, set up, right? Rather than looking at the build form itself, you're saying the homemaking practice is informing the build form. Uh, then, Neha, in your case, I think the statement that you make that with the increase in density, there is an increase in publicness, which is a very, in a way, I could say it's a very provocative statement to make, because typically, on one hand, we identify public spaces as open spaces, but in this case, there's a lot of institutions and even commercial, like shops on the lower level, uh, which you talked of as public spaces. Uh, but what I found also very fascinating, which you didn't touch upon, which I would like you to respond, is that consistently the owners move to the upper floors and the lower floors either become public or institutions, or you said in some cases are also being rented out, which is the inverse of what happens in many other situations where the owners retain the ground floor and the first floor is sublet. So I want you to reflect a little bit upon, do you think that is because of topography that the owners want to meet go up, or do you think it's because of climate that owners want to go up and not remain downstairs? Because I have seen, at least in hot and dry climates like Gujarat, Rajasthan, owners prefer to be on the ground floor. From a climatic perspective, it is much cooler than the topmost floor. In a cold and dry or cold and humid climate, the upper floor is always better, as long as you have thick walls. So I want you to sort of discuss a little bit about, do you think it is because of topography that is happening, because of access to light and ventilation and so on, or is it primarily a climatic move that people are making? Yeah. But in your case, you're talking of densification as uh, the primary way in which urbanization is happening. So now coming to uh, the fascinating sort of intersections I see between the three studies. Neha, you're talking of urbanization by looking at densification. Uh, Similarly, one could talk of urbanization as an increase in convenience, like in Whitefield when you were showing advertisements of maid services, this services. So it truly, or even when you were in response saying that when you moved away from the city, the worry is that the convenience is less. You get better nature, better open spaces, but you lose the gross 10-minute blinkit you will lose when you shift from Malleshwaram or wherever in the center to far in the outskirts. So urbanization primarily as convenience. And similarly, do you think that we could look at the process of urbanization through the lens of densification, through the lens of convenience, and what are the other lenses that are coming out in from your studies, okay, as thick descriptions? So I would just like to end by saying that, coming back to the idea of thick descriptions, I feel one of the challenges that we face, especially when when we are so engaged with our field of study, we go deep into it. Yeah. So we can see small things. And at one point, when you have to write the document, you have to come out of it and present it as an overview. The fear always is that when you present the whole thing, the nuance is lost. And I see that struggle in the drawings as well as the presentations that you're making. There's so much nuance you want to tell. So my question is about, how do we draw insights from thick descriptions? Do complex, nuanced fields of study require complex, nuanced insights, or do they require deep but simple insights? Can I pick up a simple strand and have a deep insight, or is it because the field is so complex, your conclusion also has to be a jumbled, complex thing? Think about it. Yeah.
I mean, I think I would like to imagine my thesis as a simple insights, but I think to some degree it has a lot of depth to it as well. Um, and just and I mean, again, related to this, why did I choose the method of watercolor? I think the pictures in my book do, I mean, they are my primary method of um, putting forward these thick descriptions that I'm also explaining in the story. But I think the watercolors try and fill up the gaps where, in certain instances, the picture is not able to provide, or in instances where a picture is not so explicit that it provides such a thick description. description. For example, I mean, the two-let board that you mentioned, I think that um, in entirety is my site for that particular neighborhood. And along with that, there are one or two pictures in each neighborhood which really gives an entire description of it. And mainly because I was going through the format of stories and sort of keeping it a little light, but providing instances of the everyday, the um, the different people that come and go in it. The sketches sort of provide something to go along with the text right by the side, and not something so heavy as a picture. Um, and coming back to the the question you asked about this shift in tension in the urban village fabric. So it is not that the village fabric has moved directly from an agrarian economy to a service sector economy. There was a brief period where industrialization and these factories had popped up in the peripheries of the city. So people did look at these in like as forms of job opportunities and so on, but this was for a very short period of time. The moment the larger umbrella of the IT industry came in, uh, I mean, so first the shift happened from agrarian to the blue collar job, again in the eyes of like dignity, much like it's you don't have to depend on certain shifts in the year on your income. Um, but the moment the service sector came, it removed the degree of um, or the organization these smaller blue collar job factories gave. You are because you are now though though you're working as a janitor or a plumber or so on, you're still working under the larger umbrella of a corporate which provides a certain much better degree of security. Now the tension arises when these changes happen so quickly, and yes, like I am pointing to the fact that there is a tension arising because this urbanization has happened so fast. That is because the relationships one has been able to build in a community has not taken the time to really sort of deepen. As in, it's it's continuously changing, which again induces the anxiety of security. Who is this person? Oh, this person's come here. That this person's come here. And which there's a certain amount of distrust as well because you are seeing new faces every day, and the community is not the same, and not the same for a long period of time. Um, and the aspirations you're saying that would it be slightly different if the IT sector um, had not come? Yes, I am hinting to that. In the sense that these are largely um, Western corporations which put forward a certain image which is a Western image of a lifestyle or a certain particular way of living. But I am not saying that this is happening only in Whitefield. This has been happening in most IT peripheries of Bangalore. I mean, Kanakpura Road as well has these huge housings which are coming up. But there are these smaller like the industrial pockets in Bangalore have not seen the same sort of rigor that the other localities have been seeing. For example, the northwestern part where the main warehouses in Pina are, the number of it's a very different class altogether who live there. I mean, the blue collared industry does not seem to push the aspiration of this Western form of living as much as the IT sector has been doing.
So the four cases that I selected for the homemaking practices, they were quite, the reason behind actually selecting them was the cultural logics through which they operated was actually quite interesting for me because it's not just the because it's not just the state or the government or the local politics, but more than that, it's the agency of people. Like in the fourth case, it's the agency of farmers, specifically than the industrial workers. So in the third case, and as you said, the impact of governance or the impact of the state is quite lesser in terms of the villages or than with the cities. So the cultural, it's the agency of people that kind of operates the homemaking practices here. And with respect to the insights for thick descriptions, I think if we figure out a way to draw these thick descriptions as thick networks now, I think we can map them out properly, where these descriptions place these forces on a whole larger narrative, where it can be understood at a very far level as well as the homemaking level as well.
To that, it is interesting to dwell on that a little bit further. I'm imagining that, let us say your conclusion is a mind map which has a thick network of descriptions or part sketches, but then you are inviting the reader to draw their own conclusions from that, and your conclusion is one step or one more step where you just write one sentence. I mean, those are two different imaginations, that I stop at a mind map which is complex, and that is your reading, that is my reading, or we read from it whatever way you want. Or should that then get distilled into one sentence? Was the question.
I think one sentence, it's actually the mind map will actually work.
Yeah, so the question that you asked me about the renters and the owners, so that pattern is not just in this neighborhood, but it is seen in the entire city. Like the owners prefer living above because of the topography, like the retaining walls, they create a lot of dampness, and then there are a lot of other moisture issues and ventilation issues, and even the it allows for smaller rooms to happen on the lower floors, but now since the owners aspirations are changing, they want larger spacious rooms, they want larger drawing rooms, larger kitchens, lot of open floor plans coming in. So they prefer living on the above floors. The lower floors are, and they want more private space, internalized spaces. They want one entrance, but the lower floors are relatively more open. The renters who live, they occupy usually two to three rooms, so they prefer keeping their windows, doors open, and they have these common corridors. So yeah.
10 minutes to 12. We will not take a break because I want to invite others. I'm sure there are other people who want to. We'll take a 3 minute as a.
Very interesting work and a very interesting conversation also. I mean, like together your work, draws attention to the ways in which reading cities in particular ways produces an epistemic violence. Here, seeing the city from top in a cartographic plan produces an epistemic violence, which you open out very powerfully. In Neha's work, I mean, reading Gangtok in plan, which is topographically working in a section, is a primary epistemic violence. In both your work, but also again in Neha's work, you are also opening out the ways in which cities work as networks. And therefore, the plan becomes the map, the bird's eye view becomes an epistemic violence. The epistemic violence also works in another way, which is the idea of the vocabulary. What do you call these places which seem to be on the outskirts of the cities, which have got varied kinds of names? Peri-urban, extended urban, urbanization, urban superorganism, and so on and so forth. It's almost as if the opening up of the urban and rural binary, like the problematization of what is urban and what is rural, has led all kinds of spatial practitioners to make George Louis Borges's map, that you can keep on inventing names and the list will just get longer. But what I find very interesting about some things that are common in your work is that you've opened out the ways in which cities or these such places on the outskirts of cities work as fragments. And in Neha's work, when you see the drawing of the section where the church, the court happens, and then there is another space which is in another building, which is, I didn't catch it whether it was the church or whether it was another public space. What was it? Was a church in the other building also, or a restaurant? So, I mean, it's not happening in one building, but it cuts across buildings. When you talk about Pranav, when you talk about single youth or living as a group of male migrants, purchase food from a kitchen elsewhere. The home just doesn't happen in one place, but happens in fragments. In your case, you drew attention, Aditya, to people shifting between rural and urban occupations, but also networks kind of emerging in place. I want you all to ask, or I want you to think a little bit individually, and can you talk a little bit to the question that I have over here? Pranav, my question for you is this. You made a very important observation when you spoke about the half-acre plot. And this happened sometime in the mid-19th century, the imagination of the half-acre plot, which is now transforming, which produced a home and a garden. You look at Sanjeev, you look at Nikhil Rao's work, House But Without Garden, or Sanjeev Vidyarthi's work, who talks about how the American suburb came to Jaipur. You seem to say in your work over here, it's not that ideas are coming from the West necessarily. The garden idea was Ebenezer Howard's garden city idea, which kind of traveled in many places, or the neighborhood idea plan of mid-20th century US, which came to India. These scholars kind of point. But you point out that there were ideas that were emerging itself over here. Like Louis Kahn's Broadacre Cities idea is a much later. That the idea of the half-acre plots is much older over here. In these half-acre plots, you say that there is more securitization, more privatization that is happening now. Earlier, they were porous. Now, I want you to think a little bit about it. Does visual porosity of those fences really account for them being porous? Or is it that the form of security has changed in these places? Because there is a historical depth in your work, and if you can reflect a little bit about that, that will be very nice. And how do people of different kinds transcend the boundaries that seem to be non-porous? Can you just reflect on that a little bit? In your work, Aditya, like drawing attention to the whole idea that caste seems to be central to the production of build form, homemaking practices, and cities at large is very important. But in the change that is taking place, are they reproducing the older relationships of caste, or is there any kind of slight change you might be observing? do they open up something in the change that is taking place? Is something new happening in that, if you can talk, or is it just the same thing that is getting repeated in that? And I have a similar question for you, Neha. I mean, my attention to that church drawing was because, you have so many communities in Gangtok, Bhutias, Lepchas, several Hindu communities, but also Catholics. What kinds of relationships seem to be emerging in that, which are producing such spaces? Are they working as a single religiously organized or a kin-based organization, older kin-based organization, or something new is happening in the migration that is taking place?
Yeah. So coming to the half acre plot. So the context where these plots are situated in is important because the entire community where it is in was, well, it was a community just full of Anglo Indians. Now I would not necessarily say that this just because there was a picket fence and a low compound wall, it was porous to anyone outside the community. I mean, in this particular case, it becomes a form of communication with the neighbors and so on. But the moment newer stakeholders begin to enter, that anxiety or that suspicion starts to creep in, and then it begins to take a physical form as very flat compound walls and so on. But I do not want to say that just because there was a lower compound wall, there was more porosity. I would, in this particular context, I would like to say the porosity existed within the community largely. So just to clarify that.
There's a shift in occupation. There's a shift in lifestyle and the ways of living. Even the built form, with all the politics that happen around or the stories happen around, but I think the idea of home for them remains the same. Yeah.
I think there are newer forms of communities that are emerging because of the migration. So the churches, they use the one that I showed. That church had always been there, and it was always handled by the family. But then now the newer migration are forming newer groups, and then they work in collaboration. So there are new forms of communities that are emerging.
I would just like to add that the half acre plot in itself is very imposing. I mean, just seeing a large garden and a bungalow in the end just makes you sort of want to stay away. But I think the people who live over there in that context don't really look at it that way. So, I mean, it was interesting. I mean, it's porous for some, but not porous for others, which is how most gated communities work.
Thanks, guys. We are really out of time. We'll take a 3 minutes break, Raj. 3 minutes break. The other three, please come in and load your presentations, whereas everybody kind of go and stretch and come back. Thanks.